I think when you talk about the roots of R&B, you have to remember that all black music, with the exception of the gospel spiritual angle, was lumped together as race music. And that it was the same whether or not you were a guitar player from the South or whether or not you were a big band from Harlem. I mean, essentially it was all race music. I think what rhythm and blues did, and what your dad did by coining the term rhythm and blues, was to identify something that had been going on within race music, which was separate and significant in its own way. Now, musically, you can say, well, this is stuff that came out of the black bands, or it came out of the small groups like Louis Jordan and Eddie Cleanhead Vincent and people like that. But you could hear it evolving. You could hear boogie woogie as part of that 10 years after it had been introduced. Always a very strong blues component to the music, but not only blues. There was some wonderful blue ballads that Amos Milburn sang in those years and that Louis Jordan sang in those years. It was all a part of something that was separating itself from jazz and separating itself from country blues. And the Charles Brown drifting blues, they're all done within a year or so of each other, and most of the small band stuff came out of California.
Right, right.
If you think about it, Charles Brown and Amos Milburn and Cecil Gant and Hatter Brooks, and even Nat Cole had a bluesy side to him, not one that was well known, but his trio instrumentation was that was Johnny Moore's Three Blazers.
And that's where Charles Brown came
Yeah.
out.
So, I mean, your dad used to talk about this as little club blues.
Right, right.
In the sense that there were small combos, 3, 4, maybe 6 pieces tops.
Yes.
You know, and that they were able to work in these little clubs where you could get 65 or 70 people in and pack the joint, as opposed to a big band that would need a ballroom or a concert hall in order to fill the house and play for a packed house. The ones that lasted, Erskine Hawkins lasts into the early 50s. Buddy Johnson lasts into the late 50s. Lionel Hampton lasted into the 60s. Now, they weren't necessarily playing the same things in the 60s or the late 50s that they did in 1945. But, Lucky Millinder was the first to get out, and he was a very successful band leader.
Right.
But he wasn't a musician. He was simply a front man.
Right, right.
And I think he simply grew tired of the travel.
Yes.
He died young. Lucky died he was only 56 when he died in 1966. But he'd been off the road for more than a decade at that time. Lucky developed a lot of popular singers. Probably the most prominent was Wynonie Harris. Ernestine Allen was another one. Buddy Johnson's band developed Arthur Prysock,
right.
in addition to Ella Johnson, who was Buddy's sister.
Right.
Hampton didn't have that much luck with vocalists initially, but Dinah Washington came out of there. Winnie Brown came out of there. Little Jimmy Scott came out of there. And while we may think of these bands as really hard rockin' big bands, in many respects it was the balladeers who made a big difference in those bands. Erskine Hawkins singers weren't nearly as good as the others, but at the same time, Jimmy Mitchell had Don't Cry, Baby, and
right.
They had people within the band. Trevor Bacon, the guitarist, was another one who sang ballads, if you remember Sweet Slumber. Things like this. They had musicians within the band who were capable of singing as well. So each of the bands handled it differently, but each of them brought together a mix that always had a ballad as a part of what they did. And they had to be ballads. They had to be ballads that black people could relate to.
Yes.
Because so much of the Irving Berlin kind of stuff you may think of as having a universal appeal. I'm not so sure. I mean, he isn't as his stuff doesn't resonate with black audiences as much as, say, people like Curtis Lewis or Percy Mayfield or
right.
people who were songwriters, the first black songwriters, really. Well, Jimmy Rushing's basic employment was with Count Basie's orchestra. Now, Count Basie was always a band that emphasized blues, but they always had that Kansas City kind of rhythm.
Yes.
That Kansas City kind of rhythm stayed with Basie even into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, no question, but it was modified in those years. But that basic sound of Freddie Green's guitar and that walking bass and Basie's very spare piano sound, that was the Count Basie sound. And that's the sound that fueled Jimmy Rushing. If you remember Jimmy Rushing, after he left Basie, I think it was 1949 he left, and he would begin working on his own, making his own records after that. He always used Basie guys because he felt most comfortable in that pocket. Joe Turner was a different cup of tea. Joe Turner was a guy who could swing with the best of them, and if you listen to some of his early recordings, I mean, they're great swing records. But once Ahmet gets a hold of them, once Ahmet and Jerry start producing them in the 50s, I mean, he is rocking.
Right.
And he developed a whole new personality. You know, who thinks of a 45-year-old fat man as a rock and roll star? But that's Big Joe Turner. And, you know, he could shout down the house.
You know,
I don't know whether you know it or not, but late in the relationship with Joe and Atlantic, they did a version of Sweet Sue.
okay.
Do you know that?
I don't know the record.
Now, it was out as a single. It was never on an LP until we got it into the time that I was working with Atlantic in the 80s. There is a swing feel on that, a swing feel in 1958, and it's wonderful. Boss of the Blues is a Kansas City jazz record, first and foremost.
Yeah.
That Joe Turner is the singer is secondary. But Boss of the Blues is, I think, everybody who ever worked or listened to stuff at Atlantic would say that's the label masterpiece. The early years of Atlantic, remember they recorded about 100 sides in 1947 before anything was ever issued. And they didn't quite know what they were getting into. Now, they had Tiny Grimes. Tiny Grimes was a popular guitar player, combo leader around New York. They knew that they weren't going to get killed making Tiny Grimes records. They knew that the sound of the Joe Morris band that they had put together with Johnny Griffin that actually came out of Lionel Hampton's band, they knew that well enough, so they knew they weren't going to get killed with that. But they didn't know whether the Harlem Airs were going to mean anything. They didn't know whether some of the other performers that they recorded during that time were going to mean anything. All they knew is this, is that they're starting a record label when you can't make any more records. And they have to have enough stuff to get themselves out there. In 1948, the American Federation of Musicians called a strike of its members, and union musicians were not permitted to make records.
Right.
Now, if you remember the strike, the similar strike happened between August 1st, 1942 and the fall of 1943. Nobody knew how long the strike was going to last, since the first one lasted about 18 months, and then for some labels actually another year beyond that. So they had to prepare themselves for this, and they had to have stuff ready to go, so to speak. And I think they did. In large measure, they managed to get through a very difficult time. They actually did a bootleg session with Tiny Grimes in Cleveland in August of 1948, where they came up with Loch Lomond and some things that actually sold well for them at the time, and that were able to introduce Red Prysock, a great tenor player who was in Tiny's band at the time. And of course, by the time things settled out in December of 48, they were able to jump right back into it again. In many respects, they were ready to go with Ruth Brown in 1948, but Ruth Brown was in an auto accident, was out of action, and to a certain extent, they couldn't have done anything with her at the time. And in April of 49, when she was ready to go, they started right in with her, and she was really the first act who really had a major impact on the label. Stick McGee had the first hit with Drinkin' Wine, Spodiote, but Ruth Brown, I think, was the first artist who really made an impact on the label. Well, Ruth Brown came up in the pre-rhythm and blues era. She would have known the work of Dinah Washington, but she would have known the work of Sarah Vaughan. She would have known the work of Ella Fitzgerald as well. And in many respects, those performers helped her form her first repertoire. When she gets to Atlantic, I think Ahmet recognizes the fact that she can sing standard ballads as well as anybody. Remember, the first record that actually made any noise with Ruth was So Long.
All right, yeah.
Which was not Russ Freeman, but what was his name? Not Will Bradley, but Russ Morgan. It was Russ Morgan's theme song.
Right.
And that's a tune that went back to the 30s, and it was as square a white tune as you can imagine, but Ruth invested her own thing in it. And that's something that she could do with other material. Now, they started writing for her, and of course, when they come to Teardrops in Your Eyes in late 49, and they put Willis Jackson and his tenor on that record, that started a personal relationship with them for 7 or 8 years.
Right.
They were actually married for several years of that time, but Willis was the tenor player on a lot of her early records, and to have that kind of strength on rhythm and blues records at the time was a little bit unusual. So many of the records that you made in 1949, even when you were making R&B records, you would record the whole band as is,
right,
without substitutions. I think in large measure, when your dad and Ahmet get together in 1953, they change all that. Jerry told me that when they would go to New Orleans in 1956 to record Guitar Slim, for example, they would record Slim's band, but they would bring in Edgar Blanchard to play guitar and to settle the rhythm section, and they would bring in Red Tyler to play baritone and settle the horn players out, so that you had a very professional sounding product where the band by itself might not be that good. And of course, what they did with doing the individual sidemen, putting together that great Atlantic house band, that was genius. Nobody was doing that at the time. Everybody talks about the Funk Brothers or the Stax house rhythm section, things like this. Ahmet and Jerry were doing that in 1953, years before those labels were formed. The fact that Ahmet and Jerry were both record collectors as teenagers made their approach a little bit different. I mean, Leonard Chess and his brother Phil, Don Roby, Morris Levy, they came up through nightclubs. Other guys came up through having retail stores. But Ahmet and Jerry were record collectors, and you tended to find their approach more among the jazz labels, among the Blue Notes and the Prestiges and labels like that. But they applied that sensibility to R&B in the sense that what they heard, they knew how to augment it in the best possible way. Obviously, when you're making records, whether it's R&B or pop records, you're always looking for great songs. But sometimes if you don't have great songs, you've got to have a great groove. And that rhythm section that they put together for Atlantic was capable of coming up with great grooves all the time. Years later, I was talking with a veteran record man about what Ahmet and Jerry had done. And he always said, the first time I worked with him, I worked with Clyde McPhatter. And he said, we were sitting there with that powerhouse Atlantic rhythm section. And that was the word he used, powerhouse. There was strength in every chair. Those guys knew how to make anybody sound good. You want to hear some interesting things, go back to the obscurities. Go back to some of the rhythm and blues groups or some of the shouters who didn't make it, who may have only done 1 or 2 sessions. But you're going to hear powerhouse rhythm sections on those records too. And if you didn't know the history or the relative failure of some of those recordings, you would think they were hits just because of how good they sounded. And Ahmet once told me, he said he and Jerry picked all the musicians. So I'm convinced that they were the ones who put that band together and then told Howard Biggs or Jesse Stone that these are the guys you will be working with on a regular basis, okay? And because you're working with them on a regular basis, you'll know instinctively what their strengths and weaknesses are. And you'll be able to bring out the best in each of them, and collectively, they're going to knock everybody dead. And that's exactly what happened. If I was to choose a year that really made a difference for Atlantic, I think it would be 1954. In large measure, that's the first year that your dad and Ahmet worked together throughout the entire year. That was the year that great rhythm section came together. And you think of the disparate elements, Harry Van Walls, the piano player, Lloyd Trotman on bass, Connie Kay, who was a regular drummer with Lester Young's quintet, was the house drummer at that time. He later went on to the MJQ. And then, of course, the great Mickey Baker. And your dad had nothing but great words to say about Mickey Baker and how important he was to the sound of that band. And then the fifth member, and the one who nobody talks about at Atlantic, and I never could figure out why, Sam the Man Taylor. He's the tenor player probably on 65% of the records in 53, 54, 55, 56. Now, his luster is a little bit dimmed when King Curtis comes along. But in large measure, Sam was the first call tenor player. I mean, Big Al Sears was on some records, Jesse Powell was on some records, but most of it's Sam the Man Taylor. I mean, Sam the Man Taylor is on more Drifters records than Clyde McPhatter. That's how important it was. And that consistency, 53, 54, 55, I think they begin to see the white labels on the horizon.
Yes.
And they think that maybe they have to start changing things. But Ray Charles made great records in 55. Ruth Brown made great records in 55. Drifters had Ruby Baby and Adorable in 1955.
Big record, yes.
You know, so that great records were being made all through that time. 56 is the year that things start to change. Solomon Burke plays a major role in the revival of Atlantic's black music. If you recall the period just before he comes in, you know, you're all of a sudden Ray Charles is gone. Bobby Darin is the big deal at the label. It's a little bit before Nino and April and Sonny and Cher are doing their white pop thing, but Acker Bilk was on the scene with Stranger on the Shore, if you recall that. And let's put it this way, the artistic aesthetic that one would have hoped for from the Ertugun Wexler combination was lacking at that time. And there may be reasons for it that we don't necessarily know, but when Solomon Burke comes along at the end of 1960, Jerry gets into it full time. And all of a sudden, that, I think, sparks the entire decade for Jerry Wexler. Because Solomon Burke was the first guy that he brought in by himself, and the first one that was his production start to finish. And I think those records last wonderfully well. And you think of the diversity. I mean, Solomon Burke was a boy preacher.
Yes.
You know, he was also one of the great hustlers of all time.
Yes.
He would, you know, he had a mortuary license, mortuary business that he ran on the side. So, Solomon Burke was the kind of guy that if you were on a tour bus, Solomon Burke would buy up all kinds of food to sell to the musicians and the singers while they were on long bus trips. But at the same time, Solomon Burke had one of the great voices of all time. And it didn't matter whether you were singing gospel or whether you were singing country or whether you were singing Bob Dylan songs. He could make it work. And that's the beauty of what Jerry did with Solomon Burke is this. He recognized that Solomon Burke could sing anything, so he'd give him a country song. And all of a sudden, it's not a country song anymore, it's a Solomon Burke song. And Solomon Burke had that ability to put his own personal stamp on things. And I think that what Jerry and to a certain extent Burt Burns also did with Solomon Burke during that time was huge. I mean, that pointed the way for so many things that they could do in the future. It's astonishing, really. And after Solomon Burke, you get to Wilson Pickett, and then after Wilson Pickett, you get to Aretha, and, you know, wow. When Jerry starts going south, first to Memphis, to work and to record Wilson Pickett down there.
Right.
I think he recognized that things were a little bit looser. Guys weren't looking at the clock as much, and you had a little bit more time to develop ideas in the studio itself.
Right.
And that was something that he did much more of than Ahmet ever did. Ahmet would always rely on arrangers. You know, if Ahmet was recording Benny King, they would have somebody there with everything written out.
Okay.
With Jerry, I think it's because he knew the rhythm sections he was working with, first in Memphis, but most importantly in Muscle Shoals, that he knew what those guys were capable of. And he knew if Jimmy Johnson could come up with an idea or David Hood could come up with an idea, that they knew how it would work. And so he encouraged it. You know, record dates are much more participatory than a lot of people realize, and especially record dates where you're doing rhythm tracks first, which is basically, I think, how they worked once they started working with Aretha. And it worked very much to their benefit. The thing that's interesting about the Aretha records, which a lot of people don't know to this day, is she played her own piano.
Yes.
And on virtually all the rhythm tracks, she played her own piano. She set the groove. She was spectacular that way. Aretha Franklin's going to be 70 years old in 2012. And if you see her starting to come back to her friends and to the music world more frequently, that's a wondrous thing. Because for a long period of time, it seemed like she was in some kind of a depression or a funk. She didn't want to come out. She didn't want to see people. She stayed in Detroit for years and years and never went anywhere, canceled dozens of gigs. Now, it looks like she relishes the opportunity to get back into it again. And to deal with old friends, perhaps for the last time, but at least to deal with them again. Well, I think you can make a case for the fact that soul music begins in the early 60s, and the original inspiration is the work that Ray Charles did on Atlantic. I don't think there's anybody. I mean, Atlantic started using the phrase soul to deal with Ray Charles music, and it simply spread to other people who were doing similar kinds of things. And I think in that regard, you can make a case that whatever Stax was doing in Memphis, which starts in 1962, that came out of what Ray Charles was doing, more so than any other particular artist. And yeah, Rufus Thomas had been around the block before, but he was no big deal. And they used Memphis musicians kind of in the same way that Ray would use his musicians. You know, there was a lot of organ and piano overdubbed on the Stax stuff. Now, that's a basic gospel sound. You hear that in gospel church music all the time, piano and organ together. So that they start that on Stax and it spreads like wildfire. Everybody's into it. I'm sure that sound influenced Jerry in some of the work that he did with Pickett and some of the work he did later on. But the soul music thing keeps going. It generates steam unto itself, and it's very different from what Motown was doing. Now, Motown could have pop music, and they could have pop artists. Occasionally, you would hear some soul music come out of Motown, but most of the time, it was pop music tailored for a pop artist, and you wouldn't know, if you didn't know who the artists were, that they were black.
Right.
Berry Gordy had excised the blues out of rhythm and blues to make Motown music. Jerry embraced them to make soul records. Stevie was to Motown, I think, the way Ray was to Atlantic. He always did his things his way. And he would sweet-talk Smokey, and he would sweet-talk Berry, and talk about all the other things, etc. But ultimately, it came out as a Stevie Wonder record. And it would be unlike the Marvelettes or the Supremes or Shorty Long or some of the other people who were recording for Motown during that time. Stevie Wonder had a gift that, you see once in a generation if you're lucky. If you want to look at the late 60s and 70s soul records that were on Atlantic, and of course they were still called soul records because Atlantic is identified with that term, but the Spinners came from Motown. They were originally a Motown group. Now, they had a lot of hits on Atlantic, more hits on Atlantic than they did on Motown. But the fact of the matter is, I think the modus operandi that they were accustomed to in making records was not the Atlantic way of doing things, but the Motown way of doing things. And it was interesting to see that idea that the way to make records could travel from Motown to Atlantic, because in many respects they were polar opposites in the way they did things. Now, Motown had its own rhythm section in the same way the Atlantic did, if you want to talk about the Funk Brothers, although there were probably 35 or 40 Funk Brothers at one time or another. But the basic idea was fine. You get the rhythm track set, and then you put the vocals on later.
Yeah.
And once that became the way that everybody was making records, you would find producers and arrangers with more control.
Yeah.
And they would want to take more control to make sure things were done perfectly. A lot of very perfect black records at that time that are not of all that great an interest today, but if you listen to Jackie Moore or you listen to some of the Southern soul artists who were on Atlantic or Stax during that time, that stuff still rings true today.
Yeah.
And I think it's because it's basic emotion unfettered by progress. I think Motown's influence on the music business to a certain extent is longer lasting than Atlantic's, simply because they came about later than Atlantic did. And to a certain extent, the way they did things kind of made it easier to make records than Atlantic did. If Atlantic relied more on the inspiration of the artist, Motown relied more on the precision machine. I think that it all becomes rather moot in the mid-'70s when disco comes along and flattens everything. I mean, that to me is the end of the great era of black music in America. Well, with Aretha, you're just looking at a great voice, period. The fact of the matter is Atlantic benefits by the fact that she had been on Columbia for 6 years before they got her. Because your father knew exactly what to do with Aretha Franklin as soon as he got a chance to work with her. But I think one of the reasons that he had that knowledge was because what Columbia did and essentially failed with. Not that those records are bad. The Columbia records are interesting in their own way, but they're not Aretha Franklin records. What your father does is make Aretha Franklin records for the first time. I think what they did with Columbia is that they wanted to record her the way they would record any black singer at the time, which was roughly the way they would record any white singer. Put an orchestra behind her, choose the songs, make sure that they don't run more than 3 minutes and 20 seconds, put 12 of them on an album or 2 of them on a single, and send them out to the world. I think there was a little more intelligence with the way Atlantic approached it. If you want to think about it, the early rock and roll and the early soul era had a lot of tragedy in it. You want to think about Buddy Holly dying as young as he did, or Sam Cooke dying as young as he did, or Otis Redding dying as young as he did. You say to yourself, what could these people have accomplished over a lengthy period of time? Well, if they had accomplished simply more of the same, I think we would have been happy, because all three of them were at a creative peak when they went. I mean, Otis's first #1 record was the one that came out after his death. And I think he was moving in a direction which would have proved wonderful for not only for his career, but for those of us who are fans of his music. If you listen to Otis Redding's music in 2012, I think that if you go through the entire oeuvre, you'll come up with the idea that the ballads are the ones that ring out most. I can remember on The Sopranos, a few years ago, there was an episode where Tony Soprano had been shot and he was in the hospital. And they opened up with a long shot and Otis Redding singing A Lover's Prayer. And I'm saying, my God, you cannot improve upon that in terms of a dramatic piece of music for that particular situation. And it was not a big hit of Otis. It was an album track. I don't know that it was ever even on a single. But you went back and listened to it and you said, wow, how did I miss this? Why wasn't I thunderously aware of this before? Sometimes an artist of Otis Redding's stature, you can find things that perhaps may have slipped by you at one point, yet they're just as great when you come to them as they were when they were made. As I said before, Ray Charles always wanted to do his things his way. And I know that when he left Atlantic to make his big deal with ABC, that was a sea change of a thing at Atlantic, because I don't think either Ahmet or Jerry felt that there would not be Ray Charles in their life. It was the kind of thing that they would think years ahead in planning what they wanted to do with him. You know, they would make a jazz trio record with Ray playing piano in 1956, or they would make an album by his whole band with him not singing at all. They had all kinds of things that they could do with this guy. They could put a steel guitar on behind a band and have him sing a Hank Snow song. You know, and Ray Charles could make all of this work. And I think that the idea that somehow or another he would not be available to them was something that hurt them very deeply. Think about Ray Charles. Is there another person in the world who you would want to hear sing America the Beautiful? You know, Ray Charles had his ability to put his stamp on things. I mean, Drown in My Own Tears, you listen to that and you say, my God, how did he come up with this? That is the slowest record ever made. It's incredible. And he had just this instinctive ability to know exactly what to do with a piece of music. I don't know whether his country and Western music stands up as well as some of his other things, largely because the backing seems a little square and a little corny by today's standards. But there's no denying that he could sing that material and make it work. That's a gift. You don't find that. I mean, Aretha could sing blues. She could sing gospel, and she was the greatest soul singer of the time. But I don't think that she could necessarily sing as many things as well as Ray Charles could. Ahmet Ertugun and Jerry Wexler were partners, but they each had their own taste in music. If Jerry had had his way, I think he would have done more straight blues on Atlantic, if his was the only voice to be heard. Ahmet, I think, would have gone in more of a pop direction earlier. I think we forget the fact that Ahmet was always a big fan of New York cabaret music. And that was a side of him that people didn't know about. Now, what comes out in Jerry a little bit later is his love of country music and the way he works with Willie Nelson and people like that. Each of them kind of, I think, to a certain extent, sublimated these things to make a product that they needed to make in order to keep that company going and growing. And I think that over time, each was able to realize what he wanted to do. I don't know that Jerry ever, there were things that there were doubtless things that Jerry Wexler would love to have done in time that never got done. But that's the nature of the game. That's the nature of the business. You don't get the chance to do it all. You say to yourself, at some point in time, why wasn't there a duet record between Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin? You know, that's the first thing that leaps logically off the page. Even when Aretha was signed to Arista and Ray Charles had come back to Atlantic, you would have figured they'd been able to do something together. Why wasn't that the case? Well, it's likely business reasons that kept it from not happening. And unfortunately, the business gets in the way of a lot of decisions in the music business that might well have turned out differently. But I think that your dad, his favorite record of all time, if you asked him the one great record he made, he would say, Big Joe Turner, Boss of the Blues. There is no better Kansas City jazz record than that. And, of course, at the same time, it's a Kansas City jazz record. It's the greatest Big Joe Turner record for doing that kind of music. There's nothing better than that. Because Big Joe Turner didn't read music, working with a big band was difficult for him.
Right.
I mean, Joe was much more relaxed in front of sometimes just a piano player. If you think of the fact that that's how he got his start, there wasn't a full band behind him when he was shouting at the Reno Club. There was just Pete Johnson on the piano. So Joe Turner's music evolved over time.
Yeah.
But when it swung, it really swung, and it never swung better or harder than on Boss of the Blues. The one thing that I'll credit your dad with here is that that's not the necessarily the band that you would expect for that record. Okay. Joe Newman, okay. But Jimmy Nottingham? Jimmy Nottingham was not a well-known jazz player. I mean, he was known among the cognoscenti, but he wouldn't have been anybody's first choice. But boy, does he work beautifully in that. And Pete Brown? You know, Pete Brown hadn't made a record probably in years before that one. I know your dad did him again with Champion Jack Dupree a couple of years later on Blues from the Gutter.
Right.
But Selden Powell, Frank West, they're natural guys. Frank originally from Kansas City anyway. But Lawrence Brown? You're a cool one, as Big Joe would say.
Right.
He came out of the Ellington Band. He was a West Coast guy, you know. I mean, he was born in L.A. So, I mean, the fact that you had this disparate orchestra making wonderful music together. When I think of that record, I think of another Joe Turner record. I think of Shake, Rattle, and Roll. You think of that band. You have Wilbur de Paris on trombone on that record. Wilbur de Paris was the leader of a New Orleans jazz band in New York. You had Connie Kay on drums, who was Lester Young's drummer. And then you had Lloyd Trotman on bass and Mickey Baker on guitar. And, and Harry Van Walls on piano, and you had two other horns. You had the great Sam the Man Taylor on tenor, but you gave the solo to Haywood Henry on baritone sax. And all of a sudden, everybody in New York is making R&B records with baritone solos because of Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Well, I think that in many respects, I'm 71 now, but people of my generation owe a wondrous debt to people like your father, because your father knew how to make records with some of the great talent of the time. And we all know great talent that never gets recorded necessarily the best possible way. You can think of what Jerry and to us, well, let's just say it. What Jerry did with Aretha Franklin. How would you stack that up against what Clive Davis did with Aretha Franklin? Let's put it this way. I mean, they're two different approaches.
Yes.
And I'm sure Aretha liked to have hit records, and
Yes.
she had some hit records on Arista, plenty of them.
Yes.
But I mean, how many of those records do you remember today? But you're going to remember Dr. Feelgood forever.
Yes. Well,
That's what I'm talking about. Or Natural Woman.
Yes.
Oh, I mean, it still sends chills up your spine when you hear that.
Yes.
And I think when you bury somebody with all the pop trimmings, which is what people tended to do in the 70s and 80s and 90s, that the real artist has difficulty emerging.
Right.
Another thing while we're at it, and before I forget it, your father made the first records with Angela Straley.
Right. Right.
Never came out.
Right. No, I knew that.
I think he also did a Percy Mayfield project, which never came out.
I didn't know about that.
There was one single that did come out, but there's more stuff in the master book that I don't know whether they started a project maybe and never finished it, but there is Percy Mayfield stuff listed in the master book. Jerry Wexler was famous for going around the country and finding the best music in New Orleans or the best music in Austin, Texas, or the best music in Memphis, Tennessee. He knew how to find the best stuff in town. It's like a guy that you wanted to go to dinner with who knew all the best restaurants. He knew the best musicians and knew the best music to hear wherever he was going. Now, Ahmet would know Paris and Berlin and California, but you couldn't get Ahmet to find the best places in Memphis or in Austin unless he asked Jerry. Well, once Jerry got his foot in something, he knew what to do with it. It was really wonderful that way. I think, in effect, to a certain extent, it pointed the direction for Willie for his later career. Jerry may not have been involved in his later career, but I think Willie Nelson knew how to make records and what to do from that point forward. I don't know whether he worked with a producer, but I mean, he knew what to do. And it didn't matter whose name was on the album as a producer. They'd be Willie Nelson projects, not country music projects, but Willie Nelson projects. Your father was unique in the sense that you could talk to him about all manner of American music, and he had a knowledge of everything. I remember at one point I asked him innocently enough some question about Bob Wills, which was a band I didn't know anything about other than San Antonio Rose and stuff like that. And he gave me a 20-minute dissertation off the top of his head about Western swing, and he said it was all over by 1935. All the best stuff had been done before then. Bob Wills, he came later, And my guess is that if you went back and checked it out, he'd be right.